Hi, my name is Terry Doherty. I am the designer of the Glory and Empire series by Lock and Load Publishing. In this video, we'll cover assaults. So we'll go over some assaults. First, we'll cover the soldiers game, and then we'll go into the battalion and brigade games. The battalion and brigade games use the same assault rules, so there's no changes between those two. The battalion game adds a little bit of more detail around types of formations and what happens when you assault skirmishers. A little bit about the basics. So only infantry conducts assaults. They have to have an attack order in order to initiate an assault. And they can enter zones of control without passing a morale check because they have an assault marker. During a friendly movement phase, anytime the friendly units are moving, they can place an assault marker on their units and move adjacent to an enemy unit, indicating the target by pointing an arrow at the unit. Tom Ears is deployed in column of regiments. We'll set the leader off to the side for now. So the right-hand column will assault the leftmost British unit, which is the 50th Foot. And the left-hand column will assault the 95th Rifles on the far left. So they will march forward, and the second one will close up behind it. So it's got 2 units in the stack there. We'll put an assault marker on it. So they're assaulting 150th Foot, and same for the left column. So the difference on the left column is that because they're deployed as skirmishers, they have a extended reaction zone of 2 hexes, so they will get to make a fire attack against the French in column as they come in. So they will have a fire value of 3 against the column, which gets to add 1. So we'll assume we roll the dice and they end up in disorder. So now they are going into assault, and they also have a disorder marker. So after we've completed all the movement for the French for that turn and gone through the reserve segment for the British for that turn, then we would conclude the assaults after that happens. So let's go ahead and resolve those. And we resolve each assault from beginning to completion one at a time. So we'll start on the right-hand stack. The first thing they do is roll for an attacker morale check. So the French in column there have to roll. They have a 36, so they have to get a die roll better than 36, and there's various modifiers for their morale state, whether they're disordered or shaken. Going in with more hexes against a single defending hex is a benefit. So let's roll the dice there, and let's assume that they pass their morale check. So next thing we do is have the defenders roll their defender morale check. And again, there's modifiers there based on number of hexes that they're getting assaulted from, whether they're getting assaulted from the flank or the rear, whether they have skirmishers deployed, and things of that nature. So let's assume they roll the dice and they fail. So they're going to end up in disorder. Okay, the next step in the process is the defender and the attacker remove skirmishers markers if they have them. So the idea is that the skirmishers are pushed to the rear and form up behind the parent formation, and now it's the 2 parent battalions exchanging fire. So the defender fires first, and so the British here have a fire strength of 5, which is quite good, against a column, which is +1. They also have 8 strength points, so they'll get an additional +1. And since they failed their morale check, they do not get the well-directed fire bonus. So the well-directed fire bonus would add 2 more to their fire strength if they had passed. But now they're in disorder, so they're actually subtracting 1. So their net fire strength is going to be 6, which is still a pretty good shot against a column. They have a chance of inflicting a couple of step losses if they roll really high. So let's roll the dice and assume that they rolled a 1M minus 15. So then the top French unit would flip over the marker to reveal that he lost a step. Then they would roll the dice with minus 15. However, because it's defensive fire, they will subtract an additional minus 20 from the dice. So that's going to be minus 35. And so the concept there is that the ranges of fire combat during assaults are much closer range than normal, so the results are much more devastating than a typical firefight that might occur at 100 yards or further. So let's assume the French fail their morale checks. So now they'll become shaken, and then they'll drop back a hex for being shaken. So they drop back to there, and they are done for the turn. And that concludes that assault on that end of the line. So we'll do the other one next. Okay, so the assault on the left, it's a similar procedure. So the French have to pass their attacker morale check. If they fail, they'll become shaken and fall back a hex, and the assault will be over. If they pass, they'll get their well-directed fire bonus, and then the skirmishers, the 95th Rifles, will have to try and pass their morale check. So let's assume, and so the 95th Rifles are in full skirmish mode. So they will have a -20 on their dice because they're in light density terrain and they're in a loose order formation and won't be able to resist the assault very well. So let's assume the British fail and end up in disorder. So now the skirmishers will get to fire. And so let's assume that they roll really poorly and miss. So the French are still in their column formation and they get to fire back. So they'll have a fire strength of 1 because they're in column. They get to add 2 because they passed their morale check and got the well-directed fire bonus. However, skirmishers in light density terrain in full skirmish mode have a -2 for being in full skirmish and -1 more for being in light density terrain in the scrub there. So they will, the die roll will be back on the 0 column. So let's assume they roll a regular morale check. So then the British would then have to take a morale check with a -5 for the disorder and -15 more, or excuse me, -20 more for this occurring during the close combat sequence. So offensive fire and defensive fire, subtract that additional -20. So if they fail the morale check, they will drop 2 morale levels and become broken and retreat away. If they pass their morale check, then they'll remain in place, and that'll be the end of the assault. So let's assume they fail. So they'll break and rout away 3 hexes. So they run away 3 hexes and get a broken marker. So now the French, who are assaulting, can advance. So they can advance with 1 unit, or they can advance with both units, and they can reface. So they'll go ahead and reface and enter the hex. So now they're sort of threatening the next unit in line. And at that point, they will also undergo another reaction fire because they entered the front hexes of a unit in full skirmish mode. So they'll get another shot from the other piece of 95th Rifles in the adjacent hex. So that's it for the basics of assault for the soldiers game. So now let's cover assaults in the battalion and brigade game. They're fundamentally the same with the addition of a slight amount more chrome. So skirmishers in company formations that are in full skirmish mode must retreat when assaulted. So that'll be a slight change in how it works. And then the other addition is that the importance of following country doctrine is emphasized a little bit. So the French use the column method, so they get a benefit, or I should rather say they do not have a detriment if they assault while in column when they first declare their assault. So it's a benefit to declare the assault a little bit further away out of musket range, so you get a little bit of a morale bonus there. And then conversely for the British, they have no morale detriments when they are in line formation because that's their primarily expected fighting formation. So for the French, their ideal was that they would be in column and would deploy into line just outside of musket range and then go in line formation for the actual attack. Of course, in the battalion and brigade games, when they make that formation change, they'll have to take a disorder check. So there's some risk in that the formation change will not be conducted adequately, and they'll end up in disorder when they go into assault. So the other thing we'll show here is the importance of having skirmishers deployed in this process. And this is the same in the soldiers, battalion, and brigade game. I just wanted to leave those out mostly for the soldiers game explanation. So the first unit goes through the hexes and he changes to line formation, and then he advances into the light density terrain there, the scrub. Orients his arrow towards the unit he's assaulting. So then at that point, he'll take a disorder check. And let's assume he passes. Then when he entered the front hex of the 50th foot, which had skirmishers deployed, the skirmishers will get a shot at him. So that would be on the 1 column, but it's going to be -1 because he had his skirmishers deployed. So that's the benefit of having skirmishers deployed when facing other infantry, is they shield the parent unit. They also get a -1 because they're in the scrub terrain, so they get some cover. Now the next unit does a similar thing, so it goes adjacent, changes to line, and advances. And so let's assume that it fails the disorder check. So it ends up in disorder. And the reaction fire that the British get from them entering their zone of control while they have skirmishers deployed. They would also get reaction fire from the 95th Rifles adjacent to them. So let's assume the French survive the fire combat from the 50th foot for their reaction fire. And so then on the gotta mark them with their arrow. So then on the left-hand side, we'll do a similar thing. So the column will go in, change to line. They will take their reaction fire and take their disorder check for changing formation. Same thing on the left. And let's assume they either from the reaction fire or from the disorder check, they end up in disorder. Both units. So now the French player completes the movement of all the rest of his units. And this time I guess we'll leave Tom Ears back. His morale would normally add to a friendly unit, but that's just another modifier, so we'll leave him out for now. So after the French player concludes all of his movement, and then the British player concludes all of his reserve movement, then we do the assaults. So this time we'll start on the left. So in the battalion and brigade games, the skirmishers will be forced to retreat before they can take any morale checks. So they just basically run away because they're in a loose order formation, and they're getting assaulted by a whole bunch of guys in a formed unit. So starting on the left, they have to go back 2 or 3 hexes. So they'll just go back 2, and then they'll take a disorder check after their retreat. So then at this point, the French unit can advance, and if they want to, they can reface, but they're going to stay there. And so their assault is finished. So the next unit will go ahead and assault. So he'll have to retreat back 2 or 3 hexes. He can't retreat here because that's in a ZOC. So he can retreat through here. It's in a ZOC, but it's also friendly occupied, so he can go through. So he'll go back 3 hexes. That may be of benefit to him if the French succeed in their assaults. So now the other French unit gets to advance, and he can declare what's called a follow-on assault. Oh, the other thing I should mention is whenever units advance after combat, they enter disorder no matter what. So they're already in disorder, so they do not disorder further, and that applies to the soldiers game as well. So to conduct a follow-on assault, they're just going to orient their assault marker towards the new target hex. So they're going to join in the assault on the left-hand unit of the 50th foot. So let's go ahead and resolve the other assaults, starting with the one on the far right. So starting with the one on the far right, we go through the same process as before. So the first thing they do is take a morale check, an attacker morale check. So let's assume they pass. And then the defenders take a morale check. So for their morale check, they'll get a slight benefit from having their skirmishers deployed. So they pass their morale check. So now we remove the skirmishers markers from both hexes. So the skirmishers have been pushed back into their parent units, and now it's the parent units firing. So the defender gets to fire first. So the British have here a fire strength of 5, firing into a line. So that'll be 5, but they're in the scrub there, so that'll be -1, so that'll be on the 4. So on the 4, they roll relatively low and get an M-10, so that becomes an M-30 for defensive fire. So if the French roll low, then they'll become shaken and retreat back hex. So let's assume that happens. So they're done. Now on to the next unit. So now the both French hexes have to take morale checks, attacker morale checks. And the one on the left that already took one has to take another one for the follow-on assault. So for follow-on assaults, they can only conduct 1 per turn. So they cannot just keep marching through a line of units if they're successful, like an old guard unit might be. So let's assume the attackers both pass their morale checks, and then the British will have a benefit for having skirmishers deployed. They will have a negative for getting attacked from 2 hexes of -10. So that would be a net -5 for their morale check. And let's assume they fail, so they enter disorder. So once again, the skirmishers for both sides are driven in. And so we remove all the skirmishers markers from both sides. And then we go to fire combat. So the British will fire first, and they get to pick one of the French units to fire at. And that's one of the advantages of going in with multiple units against a single unit, as it preserves the ability of one to go in, as the defender has to make a choice. So this time the British have a fire value of 5, -1 for disorder, and -1 because they're firing at units in the scrub. So that'd be a net 3. So let's assume they roll a morale check, and that the French on the right fail. So they would enter broken, and then retreat 3 hexes, where they're broken and out of the fight for a little while. So then the French get to fire back. So they'll have a fire strength of 3, -1 for disorder, but +2 because they passed their morale check because of the well-directed fire, and then -1 for the scrub. So that results in a net 3. So let's assume they roll an M-15. So that would then be M-15 for the morale check itself, then -5 more for disorder, and -20 more because it's an offensive fire. So that would be a -40 net. So they'd have to roll greater than 75 in order to pass, which is a tall order. So let's assume that they fail. So then they would become broken and retreat 3 hexes. And then the French advance into the hex. And they're still in disorder because that's what they were in before. They don't disorder additionally for advance after combat, so they're done. So one final note about assaults is defenders never advance after combat, only attackers. And attackers, when they advance after combat, they can reface. So he could face this way, which might leave his flank open, but might be a benefit against attacking the next unit. And this unit had already conducted 1 follow-on assault, so he cannot conduct another. So in all 3 rule sets, units that are in built-up terrain trigger a slightly different sequence of play for assaults after the morale checks and offensive and defensive fire are resolved. So we'll run through some of those here. So the right-hand unit will move forward 3 hexes and assault the skirmishers, and again they'll undergo reaction fire, so we'll assume they pass. And the left-hand unit will assault the 50th foot in red, and we'll assume they pass any morale checks that they may have caused. They have no skirmishers out, so we'll leave it at that. Leave the skirmishers out this time. So we'll resolve the one on the right first. So versus the skirmishers must retreat again, so they'll go back 2 hexes. The French units can advance, and then they can conduct a follow-on assault. So they'll enter the hex. So now on the left-hand side, with the troops contributing from the follow-on assault, they'll have 2 units going after the 50th foot. Units conducting a follow-on assault will enter disorder before entering the hex if they're not already in disorder. And I misspoke earlier about skirmishers and disorder checks. So skirmishers, when they retreat before a combat, they'll lose 1 morale level. So if they're in the normal morale state, they'll enter disorder at the end, and they'll do that automatically without a disorder check. So now we have the 2 units going after the 50th foot there. So per usual, the French will take their attacker morale checks, and let's assume that they both pass. So they're both in, one's in disorder and the other one's in the normal morale state. And then the British would take their defender morale check, and let's assume they pass also. So now we have fire combat. So the British will have a fire combat value of 1 because they are in column formation in the village, which is required for medium density terrain. They can only be in full skirmish or a column in villages or towns if they're medium density or high density. And the French are also in column. One of them's in the town hex and the other one's in the open. So the British will conduct their defensive fire at the one in the open, so they'll have a fire value of 1. They are British in column, so that further reduces their fire strength by 1, so they're 0, but they're +1 for shooting at troops in column. So that puts them on the 1 column. So let's assume they get a morale check, and that's a -20 morale check per the usual offensive and defensive fire. And let's assume the French pass. So they're still hanging around, and now the French get to fire back. So they'll have the French will have a fire strength of 1, +2 for well-directed fire, but -2 for firing into a village hex. So that'll be the case for both, except for the one on the right, which has an additional -1 for disorder. So it'll be a fire strength of 1 firing at the British and a fire strength of 0. So let's assume they both miss, so there's no result on the British. So now, because they're in built-up terrain, they will go to cold steel combat. So that's bayonet fighting. So cold steel combat is the same for all 3 rule sets. So we add up combat value modifiers for the attacker and add up combat value modifiers for the defender. Each side rolls 1 die and adds their combat value modifiers, and the high die roll wins. So the French will add up the combat value modifiers for each of their units there, which is 1 for each one. So that's a +2. One of them is in disorder, so his combat value modifier is now 0. So the French are a net 1. The British are 1 on the counter there in the green box. And for a village hex, the combat value modifier is +1. So the British are at +2 and the French are at +1. There's an additional modifier for the odds in terms of strength points. So the French total 8 strength points and the British total 5. So if you look at the cold steel odds table, that'll be a +1 for 3 to 2 odds, because 9 to 5, not quite 2 to 1. So the French have a net modifier of +2 and the British have a net modifier of +2. So we roll 2 dice, and let's assume the British roll a 9 and the French roll an 8. So if the British rolled a 9, that will go to modified to 11. The French will have 8 modified to 10. So if either side rolls greater 10 or more, there will be a step loss. So the French rolled a net modifier of 10, net modified die roll of 10. So the British will take a step loss. And the British rolled a net modified die roll of 11. So the French will also take a step loss. They'll choose to take it on the guy in the open. So the French take the step loss on the unit in the open. And now the loser of the close combat, which is the French in this case, because their modified die roll was less than the British modified die roll, will drop 2 morale levels and become, the French in the open will become shaken and fall back a hex, and the other units will become broken and route 3 hexes, or retreat 3 hexes. And that's pretty much it for cold steel combat. It works pretty much the same for cavalry, except for there's some different modifiers for the units. That's it for assaults. I hope you enjoyed this video.